Hello, and welcome to Module 1 on Understanding the Global Context, Instruments and Mechanisms on Financing for Climate and Disaster Resilience. We will begin this module by setting the stage and understand why do we need financing for climate and disaster resilience. The outline of this session focuses on the burden of disasters on the economy, followed by loss and damage associated with climate change, and finally on the cost of doing nothing. Let's begin with the burden of disasters on economy. Now, when we talk about economics, this is about how and why to spend resources in one way instead of another, or rather, what is the rational allocation of resources. This involves establishing the assumptions under which it is possible to justify expenditure on production, service delivery, consumption, or infrastructural investments. There is also a need to clarify assumptions using underlying expenditure decisions, which apply regardless of whether a government official is either preparing a national development plan or allocating for emergency rehabilitation and recovery program, or even if his household head is deciding on how much his or her disposable income will be allocated to food, rent, or savings. Now, the issue of allocating scarce resources between competing demands is a function of priorities, as well as technical feasibility, of course. And these priorities will vary between individuals and government departments, as well as political parties. Now, in order to allocate government-controlled public sector resources, alternatives and options have to be reviewed and questions asked. For example, how much should we spend on what, where, and when? And another way of looking at this is to decide what not to spend money on, that is, which expenditure proposal can be ignored completely or deferred. We can also ask the question, like, will this process of resource allocation be primarily through direct government expenditure, or will it be through the creation of an enabling policy environment intended to stimulate private sector consumption, production, savings, and investment? We can also ask, will the changes in a country's institutional framework be required to permit the implementation of any proposed public sector investments or policy initiatives? And lastly, we can perhaps ask this as well, which balance of government revenue, either concessional and commercial borrowing, grant assistance, and relief aid, will be most desirable and feasible for financing the public sector expenditures being proposed? One way to measure the economic impact of a natural disaster is to estimate the direct and indirect losses caused by the event. For example, a hurricane or a typhoon may destroy a factory, which we could consider as direct loss, and also disrupt the supply chain and demand for its product, which we can consider as indirect loss. Now, in order to estimate these losses, you may need to collect and analyze data to the extent and value of the damage, as well as the changes in economic indicators such as the GDP, output, or consumption. Now, the economic impact of a natural disaster is also measured through indicators. As I mentioned, direct losses, focusing on infrastructure damage, indirect losses such as business disruptions, but we also want to add human costs such as loss of life, health impacts, as well as insurance claims, macro indicators such as GDP and employment, and cost-benefit analysis. Now, these methods help quantify the financial burden, different productivity loss, and overall economic consequences of disaster. Direct economic losses usually happen during the event or within the first few hours after the event and are often assessed soon after the event to estimate recovery costs and claim insurance payments. These are tangible and relatively easy to measure. This, for example, includes losses of capital, such as the destruction of housing, factories, and means of communication, such as bridges, roads, railways, and telephone system, and community infrastructures, such as schools, hospitals, churches or mosques, electricity networks, sanitation systems, and includes also loss of stocks intended for final consumption or for intermediate production units. This also includes production losses, which will result in a reduction in income. For example, poor harvest, destruction of crops, death of livestock, or closure of small businesses, as well as the cost of emergency relief, response, and rehabilitation. Now, if we talk about the indirect economic loss, this is mostly a decline in economic value added as a consequence of the direct economic loss or human and environmental impacts. Indirect economic loss includes microeconomic impacts such as revenue declines owing to business interruption, mesoeconomic impacts such as revenue decline owing to the impacts of natural hazards, interruptions to supply chains or temporary unemployment, and macroeconomic impacts such as price increase or increase in government debt, negative impacts on stock market prices, and decline in GDP. Now, these indirect losses can also occur inside or outside of the hazard area and often have a time lag. Now, as a result, they may be intangible or also very difficult to measure. Now, each of these direct losses may have indirect effects. For example, if a factory is closed because of an earthquake, there will be a reduction in activity suppliers without alternative markets. We will also see a reduction in purchase of goods and services by people who have lost their jobs, as well as a reduction in national income through reduction in tax revenues. Now, you see in this slide that there are also quantifiable losses, which we can measure numerically, such as replacement and repair costs, mobilization costs for response and relief, and value of lost agricultural production. On the left-hand side, you'll also see the non-quantifiable losses. These are more difficult or more challenging to assign a monetary value on. Now, the primary groups impacted by natural disasters and climate risks include governments, homeowners and small businesses, farmers, as well as the poorest. Now, governments, as emergency borrowers, experience challenges to find money in a time of crisis. They also take away already budgeted resources and disrupt planned spending. Governments also face difficulties and long negotiations with providers of support and within governments to prioritize spending and have to take place during a major emergency. And on top of that, financial assistance, particularly for subnational governments and households, is also very uncertain and unpredictable. With regards to homeowners, small businesses, farmers, and the poorest, they often experience loss of income or livelihoods due to damage of often insured or underinsured assets. They experience loss of already limited assets and resources for investment in human capital. They also have a very high reliance on the government to provide post-disaster assistance, and eventually they see a decrease in expenditure on necessities such as food, health, and human capital. The government's central role in emergency relief, recovery, and reconstruction implies a large and direct financial burden. Now, this burden varies greatly across countries depending on which costs the government will shoulder, such as its contingent liability. Now, planning in advance, of course, can help governments effectively respond to these emergencies, but we still see both the direct and indirect impacts specifically for the governments. For example, the direct impacts includes emergency response and recovery expenditures, reconstruction expenditures for uninsured or underinsured public infrastructure, as well as for relocation of at-risk population. Other direct impacts include expenditure on social and economic recovery support programs and realization of contingent liabilities to state-owned enterprises, two firms that are critical to economic recovery. On the indirect impact for governments, they often see a decreased tax revenue due to economic disruption and declines in GDP growth. This also includes opportunity costs of delivering funds from development and social programs to disaster response and reconstruction. They often see as well an increased domestic and international borrowing costs, leading to debt, potential negative impacts on sovereign credit rating, as well as increased expenditures for social support programs such as safety nets, and often see a migration due to disaster impacts, leading to a loss of livelihoods. Disasters are expensive, and the burden of disasters on public finance will continue to grow, especially in the face of climate impacts. Both physical and economic losses from disasters continue to grow and is consistent with the pace of development. As mentioned earlier, there are direct losses and also indirect losses, both of which can undermine long-term economic sustainability and have much more wider economic effects. Now, for example, if critical infrastructure such as transport networks and power supply are affected, businesses suffer, and the local economy further would decline. But business is affected not only by direct and indirect disaster losses, but also by wider impacts and macroeconomic effects. For example, an inflation that might occur after a disaster. Governments, especially in less developed countries, are liable for a significant portion of the total losses from disaster events, and they rarely have the contingency financing to match this liability. We often see figures showing us the overall cost of disaster losses, but rarely do we see a breakdown. Exactly who pays for what? It turns out that in many cases, the government is actually expected to bear the economic losses. Now, when we talk about bearing the economic losses, this is coming out of the government's contingent liability, which can either be defined as explicit, which is mandated by law, such as restoration of public assets and services, or implicit, that is imposed by a social or political expectation, such as post-disaster aid for restoration of private assets. Now, governments, of course, are responsible for public assets, most notably for critical infrastructure such as communication lines and transport or water networks, just to name a few. When infrastructure fails, businesses experience indirect losses as production, distribution, and supply chains are interrupted. Consequently, the outputs are also reduced. Even when businesses do not experience direct losses, they depend on publicly managed or regulated roads and transportation lines, including energy and water networks, as well as a workforce that in turn depends on housing, education, and health facilities. Typically, in least developed and developing countries, disaster-related budgetary allocation are from annually appropriated national and local government calamity funds. In case of large-scale disasters, this calamity fund often falls short and results in the allocation of government budgetary resources from ongoing or planned development for recovery and sometimes even for relief and rehabilitation. This process of reallocation is often ad hoc and largely unrecorded, and are therefore very difficult to measure their extent without detailed examination of the budgetary operations because they occur internally and within budget heads, and therefore resulting in lost or delayed development opportunities. Now, due to the disconnect between disaster losses and disaster initiatives, this indicates that governments are unable to recognize the long-term economic impact of disasters, especially on debt structures or the role of hazard mitigation. It is necessary to recognize and integrate the negative impacts of disaster risk on economic development and disaster risk reduction as part of national development plans. It is also necessary to make financial preparations by accumulating domestic savings and foreign reserves and or by transferring some risk through commercial insurance. Now, these analyses, especially with the consideration of risk assessments, will facilitate the adoption of appropriate measures to strengthen disaster risk management and gradually remove vulnerability while treating risk reduction as an integral part of the development process. Beyond the impact on individual households, disasters affecting a large uninsured portion of a country's middle class can have a devastating social and economic impact on the country as a whole. Most homeowners are uninsured against natural disasters that can easily destroy much of a family's wealth. Also, small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, is a key indicator of a thriving middle class and can be impacted through interruptions in businesses from direct damage to their property or from damage to infrastructure or other business operations along the supply chain. Some of the direct impacts for homeowners and small businesses include reconstruction costs due to damage of often uninsured or underinsured assets, as well as healthcare and other financial costs associated with human fatalities, injuries, and disabilities. The indirect impact includes loss of income or livelihood due to business interruptions and unemployment or loss of wage earner and economic decline. Other indirect impact includes increased borrowing costs and additional expenses such as healthcare and paying for alternative accommodation during reconstruction. The agriculture sector is socially and economically very important in many countries, particularly in low-income countries. Farmers are highly exposed to multiple and often systemic risks to production. Disasters can destroy crops, kill livestock, and prohibit access to credit, which is critical to invest in livelihood, as well as markets, making it difficult for farmers to sell their crops. They may also lower demand for products, which may impact farmers' earnings as well. In addition, natural disasters can destroy public infrastructure and assets essential for agricultural production. The direct impact on farmers include reconstruction costs for often uninsured or underinsured assets, as well as restocking, replanting, or rehabilitation of productive assets such as livestock or crops. The indirect impact to farmers include loss of income for farmers and other supply chain actors due to the interruption of crop or livestock or fish stock production, and often economic decline and or lack of access to markets. Other indirect impact include increased borrowing costs as well as increased risk aversion to new and innovative investments. Now, as we all know, disasters tend to have the highest impact on the poorest and can have long-lasting consequences for human development. Climate-related hazards affect poor people's lives directly through impacts on livelihoods, reduction in crop yields or destruction of homes, and indirectly through increased food prices and food insecurity. With limited assets and capacities to absorb such shocks, the poorest are hit worse and can find themselves relying on negative coping mechanisms, such as taking children out of the school, selling assets, borrowing from moneylenders, or reducing consumption, all of which have devastating effects on long-term development. For example, the average household income in the Philippines declines about 6.6% in a year following a typhoon. Now, this causes severe reduction in household spending and human capital investments such as education and healthcare. Therefore, the poorest households suffer more financially and for longer periods of time than any other demographic. The direct impacts on the poorest include reconstruction costs for damaged assets and replacement of livestock. The indirect impact includes decreases in expenditure on food, on accommodation, and human capital, which is possibly combined with higher costs for healthcare, education, etc. This also includes loss of social support due to breakdown in the form of safety net systems such as family and community support. This also includes loss of income or unemployment and increased borrowing costs. Now let's bring climate change into the picture. The next couple of slides will focus on loss and damage associated with climate change. Loss and damage is a term used to describe how climate change is already causing serious and, in many cases, irreversible impacts around the world, particularly in vulnerable communities. While absolute economic losses are concentrated in high-income countries, the human cost of disasters falls overwhelmingly on low and middle-income countries. Losses and damages are happening now, and the risk of future losses and damages will increase with climate change. Now, climate risks are a key starting point for any analysis of loss and damage. The risk of losses and damage usually refers to the potential harm that may result from the interaction of climate-related hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. Now, these can be reduced and managed through mitigation and adaptation, as well as other interventions including disaster risk reduction, disaster risk finance, and humanitarian assistance. The risk of losses and damage will vary depending on a range of underlying factors that influence the nature of hazards in countries' exposure and vulnerability to them. This includes the changing intensity and frequency of the hazard, geographic location, exposure of people and assets, vulnerability of people and assets to that hazard, and the extent to which the immediate losses and damage have long-term implications for livelihood and larger-scale development outcomes. Now, loss and damage brought on by climate change are now a top priority on the international agenda. They also exhibit significant impacts to the Sustainable Development Agenda, particularly to SDG Target 11.5 on reducing the number of deaths, the number of people affected, and decreasing the direct economic losses, and from critical parts of Targets A, B, C, and D of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Now, COP27, for the first time, considered a funding arrangement responding to loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. The slide you see now are reported disasters showcasing recorded events, which includes economic and non-economic losses. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Underreported small-scale and slow-onset disasters, for example, tens of thousands of small-scale disasters occur each year throughout the world because of floodings, landslide, fires, and storms. Now, these events are not reported in international database, yet their impact can just be as damaging as large-scale disasters, causing death, injury, and loss of livelihoods. An analysis of records in over 104 countries found that between 2005 and 2017, small and medium localized and frequent disasters caused about 86% of all economic losses. Now, these losses are a major driver of poverty as they tend to be absorbed by low-income households and communities, including small businesses and local and national governments. Similarly, losses from slow onset hazards such as droughts are not always fully accounted for. Their effects often accumulate slowly over an extended period, and their impacts are very difficult to measure. When slow onset disasters are added to the Asia-Pacific region risk landscape, the annualized economic losses more than quadruple to about 675 billion, or around 2.4% of the region's GDP compared to previous estimates. Indirect and intangible losses are also underreported. Now, indirect effects are the subsequent or secondary results of the initial destruction, such as business interruption losses. And if we have a full consideration of all direct, indirect, and intangible losses, this would actually produce a much more higher loss estimate than the more easily quantified and commonly seen records of direct loss. We also see an underreported loss of productivity. Now, severe disasters, of course, have lasting effects on productivity. Now, analysis from the World Bank, for example, finds that during 1960 to 2018, climate-related disasters reduced annual productivity by an average of 0.5%. After 3 years, these severe climate disasters eventually lower labor productivity by about 7%, mainly through weakened total factor productivity. Supply chain disruptions are also impacted and felt across the global economy and have transboundary impacts. For example, in Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria in 2017, a major wholesale medical supply company in San Juan was unable to maintain production. And as a result, hospitals across the United States face a critical shortage and about a 600% increase in the cost of intravenous bags. Biodiversity loss is also very much underreported. The loss of biodiversity is moreover deepening the climate crisis because of reduced species abundance, local extinctions, as well as rapid degradation and or loss of ecosystems such as mangroves. Now, extreme weather events can have different types of loss and damage. The slide that you see here looks at the potential ecological impacts, the potential non-economic impacts, and the potential economic impacts. Now, I want you to focus on where the red rectangle is looking at on the potential economic impacts. So we're talking about loss of building and housing stock, loss of assets, loss of productive land, loss of income, loss of savings, increased poverty, loss of infrastructure, loss of essential services, and loss of crops and livestock. Now, if we bring in the slow onset events such as sea level rise, changes in precipitation, salinization, glacial retreat, land degradation, including desertification, we have also quite of a long list of economic losses as a result of loss and damage. This includes items such as loss of access to markets, uh, fisheries loss or damage, food insecurity, water insecurity, loss of ecosystem services, loss of social safety nets, as well as increase in social welfare costs, increase in debt, and reduced gross national income and gross domestic product, loss of trade, and loss of stock market value. And finally, let's look at the cost of doing nothing. The Asia Pacific region faces a widening gap between risk and resilience, with temperatures of 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius projected to surpass the limits of feasible adaptation, which jeopardizes sustainable development. Now, inaction and insufficient resilience building efforts will result in significant economic costs, with future costs estimated to increase from $924 billion to nearly $1 trillion US dollars. Climate change-induced disasters and hazards also pose a growing threat to food and energy security, impacting people's lives and livelihoods. The UNSCAP's flagship report on Asia-Pacific Disaster Report of 2023 has highlighted that there has been inadequate progress in disaster and climate action. Now, this is also reflected in the report on the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, which also highlights concerning trends and its targets, with many regressing and revealing insufficient global access to disaster data and risk knowledge. Now, inadequate financing for disaster risk reduction fails to match the rising economic cost of disasters. Investments in disaster risk reduction and efforts to de-risk investment remain inadequate. Official development assistance for disaster risk reduction has seen little increase since 2015. Sustainable and predictable investment is needed, including involvement from the private sector. The impact of disasters on the debt sustainability of least developed countries should be recognized, and domestic resources should be allocated to mainstream disaster risk reduction into public budgeting. Disasters and climate-related losses has already proven to destroy development gains. Climate disasters are economic risks that reverse hard-won or hard-earned developmental gains. And disasters have very high long-term impacts on GDP, as discussed in previous slides, including investments and consumption. Now, SCAP has estimated the potential losses to GDP caused by climate hazards to understand the future costs of inaction. Currently, the average annual losses from various hazards such as droughts, floods, heat waves, tropical cyclones, tsunamis, and earthquakes amount to approximately 924 billion or 2.5% of the regional GDP. The world is not on track to reduce risks. This is according to the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction of 2022. This also mentioned that the costs of disasters are increasing in both social and economic terms, threatening sustainable development. Now, we have seen that the balance sheet ignored key variables, particularly undervaluing climate change risks, including costs to ecosystems and the positive social benefits of risk reduction. Now, on top of this, the real costs of extensive risk are especially undervalued, and this gap is widening as major climate change impacts, such as sea level rise, gather pace. Now, to help measure what we value, some of the key actions are to rework financial systems to account for the real cost of risks, particularly long-term risk, and rework investment in insurance systems to incentivize risk reduction. Governments and the financial industry urgently need to improve how they account for the extent of financial assets at risk under various future climate change scenarios. Social and environmental impact assessments undertaken during the initiation of public projects also need to be extended to include regular reporting by the public sector, by major companies, as well as investments and pension funds. Now, because of risk nearsightedness, there are a few safe options offered for risk-resilient investments, such as green bonds, which help accelerate the finance of renewable energy, and other similar financial products which are needed to incentivize and ease investments that is resilient to disaster risk and climate change. And on the second point of key actions to measure what we value is to adapt national fiscal planning and risk financing to consider risk and uncertainty. Now, public sector finance stress testing methodologies need to be extended to learn from the COVID-19 pandemic and to test for a wider range of systemic risk with potentially cascading impacts. Now, the Global Assessment Report of 2022 also mentions that national budgets also need to evolve to include risk and uncertainty components so that financial planners can become more adept at adaptive planning and are better able to pivot resources in crisis situations. In addition, national and regional approaches to disaster and climate risk financing that layers risk through different forms of insurance and contingency funds also provide ways to deal with various levels of risk and uncertainty. The UNEP report on the adaptation gap from 2022 presented several key messages on adaptation costs, particularly on adaptation financing gaps. Now, this report uncovered that new estimates on adaptation finance needs for developing countries have emerged in recent years. The 76 developing countries have communicated estimates and updated nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, or within their national adaptation plans, or NAPs. Now, these two key documents indicated finance needs of about 75 billion per year from now to 2030. Now, an extrapolation of this figure based on the report to all developing countries on a per capita basis indicates that adaptation finance needs could be around 202 billion per year this decade. And combined, the mitigation adaptation finance flows in 2020 fell short of the annual US 100 billion global goal pledged by developing countries. There is a growing evidence that climate finance providers are not strategically targeting their adaptation support towards countries and population groups with the greatest vulnerability and needs. Now, the different financial providers indicate that there has been a trend of gradually increasing international adaptation finance to developing countries in recent years, but the share of total adaptation-related finance that was committed to LDCs increased from 17% in 2019 to 25% in 2020, reaching about 2.8 billion in 2020. However, the share of adaptation in total climate finance to developing countries was still at 34% in 2020 and is still far behind mitigation finance. Now, this evidence suggests that for developing countries, the estimated adaptation costs and likely adaptation financing needs could be up to 5 to 10 times higher or greater than the current international adaptation finance flows. Now, all of these consequences of climate change can be costly to address and adapt to, both financially and socially. And the longer we delay taking action to mitigate climate change, the more challenging and expensive it will become to adapt to its impacts. Therefore, taking timely and effective measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transitions to a more sustainable and low carbon future is very crucial to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and limit adaptation costs. Here are some recommended readings on the cost of doing nothing. This will also be shared on the e-learning platform for everyone's reference. Now, these readings are particularly interesting because it brings in the perspective from different angles. For example, from The Economist, this brings in the angle from the private sector on the cost of doing nothing, published by IFRC, brings in the perspective from the humanitarian side, and the publication from United Nations Environment Program looks at things from climate adaptation, including climate public finance management systems. and the publication from UNSCAP on the Asia Pacific Disaster Report, particularly looks at the climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. Thank you very much for listening, and this concludes session 1.1. If you have any questions regarding the presentation, please feel free to put it in parking, and we can discuss this further during the in-person phase. Now, many of these messages from the presentation will also be expanded throughout the training course. Thank you all again, and we wish you a safe flight, and see you in Bangkok.